I'm Drew Stevenson. This is for my Law and Economics seminar class. And here I'm going to be talking about the law and economics of voting rights and democracies. This is an economic analysis of some of our constitutional provisions of letting the citizenry participate in policy decisions and how the government is going to move forward. So let's dive in. So, when we talk about the Constitution from an economic standpoint, one of the things we need to acknowledge up front is an inherent tension between efficiency and democracy. So, democracy is where everybody gets a vote and everybody has a voice and so forth. And that is inherently messy and is going to pull the policy in a lot of different directions at once. That is going to introduce some slack in the system or some inefficiency. So, on the next level, though, we could take it to another level because the Constitution is not just about democracy or republics or things like that. It also puts a lot of restraints on the government and government actors and creates checks and balances between branches of government or between the federal government and states, and the constitutions can encourage cost maximizing policies in general. Because they put restraints on the government, that's going to make it costly for the government to act, which in theory will mean that the government has an incentive to pick its best actions or its best options when it is going to invest in acting. The constitutional provisions are designed to prevent negative externalities and encourage positive externalities. So the overall system will be not only efficient, but have growth in the national wealth and prosperity. So let's talk about gradations of the limits on government power. The argument is that if we have provisions in the Constitution, like the Bill of Rights, that are effectively restraints on the government. So we like to talk about them in our discourse as conferring some benefit or right on the people. But in practice, when we're in the courts, a right in the that's laid out in the Bill of Rights is basically almost always phrased as a restraint on the government. Congress shall make no law that does such and such, or Congress or the government shall not violate such and such a right. So these are phrased as things that the government cannot do. And so if a court or the Supreme Court especially interprets those restraints broadly and they limit the powers of the elected branch, it moves the nation towards more limited government. In other words, the more rights we protect, the less room there is for the government to move and to operate or to act. And in theory, the broader construing of rights or the restrictions on government shifts the government overall over time away from the exploitation or denigration of the politically powerless by a democratic majority. In other words, this is part and parcel with the theory that the constitutions are partly designed to protect the people that are minorities in society. And this could be a minority religious group, a minority political group of people who have particular political beliefs, or ethnic group, or religious group, or racial group, whatever it may be. The idea is that the majority in a democracy turn the power of the state against outgroups, vulnerable groups in society that the majority doesn't like because they're different somehow or they won't conform. And so if the courts have interpreted the restraints broadly, it will be more difficult for the majority to oppress various types of minority groups. So let's dig deeper into this idea that rights equal restraints. Constitutions inherently foster limited government rather than a true democratic government where that everybody's voting on every question or every policy or things like that. Obviously, we've all been taught in civics class growing up that we live not in a pure democracy or a straight democracy where We have a public referendum on every law or question, but rather in a representative democracy where we elect members to the legislature and to the executive branch, and then they supposedly carry out the wishes of the people who voted them into office. Now, limited government is in the eye of the beholder, of course, but it's good to recognize that constitutions just inherently put some limits on the exercise of state power or government power. And when I say limited government is in the eye of the beholder, a lot of times you'll hear the same people that go around talking about how we need smaller government, who the next minute will be talking about how we need to have censorship of what's shown on television, or remove books from the public libraries, or control what's being taught in public schools or even in higher ed. So people will say that they want limited government, but a lot of times they also have ways in which they want to control other people. So it is useful in economics terms to think of every right as a restraint, or every legal restraint as a right for someone else. So now let's talk a little bit about voting rights and the franchise. When we say the franchise, we're not talking about fast food restaurants. We're talking about the technical legal term for the right to vote in public elections. So the question is, why would a majority of the people living in an area or a country ever decide to expand the franchise and let new people vote who don't already get to? The fact is, we've done this several times in our history. Initially, at the founding of the country, only men voted. In some places, only property owning men could vote. And as you know, in the late 1800s, allowed non-white people to vote in our elections. And in the early 1900s, we allowed women to vote. And so we have at various junctures in our history dramatically changed our rules constitutionally about who gets to vote. There are still groups of people who live their whole lives here and who don't get to vote. So we could be talking about, in a lot of places, convicted felons may be excluded, and there is a legal movement to maybe restore voting rights for felons in some states. Now, people get very emotional about this question and thinking about letting those people vote, whether it's non-citizens or felons or things like that. But we have done this several times in our history. And the question is, why does anyone do it in the first place? Why wouldn't the majority want to keep the vote to themselves? Well, one theory that's often trotted out is that the party in power, who are the ones who could orchestrate the expansion, believes that the new voters are more likely to support their party. So this comes up a lot in our modern discourse about immigration, where the accusation is that one of the political parties favors more relaxed immigration policies, or letting more people come into the country because they believe that they will vote for their side in elections and help them win in the future. I don't think that's really the motivation. You can't count on which way people will vote many years in the future after they're allowed to vote. There's a famous historical example. In the early 1900s, the prohibition movement or temperance movement was in full swing. The movement to amend the Constitution to add a prohibition amendment was actually very popular. And you may remember it passed with a supermajority in a supermajority of states. So this had a lot of bipartisan political appeal. Even though it was popular, it wasn't popular enough to get the supermajority of votes needed for a constitutional amendment. So those who were leading the prohibition movement threw their support behind the suffrage movement, or giving women the right to vote, because prohibition was even more universally popular with women at the time than it was with men. And this actually worked. So they supported the right to vote for women, and within a few years after women getting the right to vote, they were able to secure the supermajority necessary to get a constitutional amendment prohibiting the sale of alcohol. But the way we got there was by giving more people the right to vote who favored the policy. What about the opposite, the disenfranchisement, when we talk about taking away the voting rights of some large group of the population? So, disenfranchisement of any group basically invites efforts to redistribute wealth from them to the groups that have electoral power. In other words, and this is socially costly. So, we talked early in the course in my other videos about how coerced transfers, and this could be using violence or some other type of coercion or theft, are very inefficient from a market standpoint. We end up with it creates a market failure. People won't invest if their goods are not secure and they are likely to be taken away from them, let's say at gunpoint or through manipulation or deceit or something like that. And so sometimes you have one group that has political power and they see something that another group has that they want. And so they use their majority in the legislature to diminish the voting rights of that group so that then they can use the laws to transfer wealth from that unpopular group or that minority group to the majority. There's a transfer of wealth, but these types of things don't contribute to the long-term prosperity of the country. In fact, they diminish it. Another theory is that elections actually yield really valuable information about citizens' preferences. Polling, even though it's become more and more scientific as the years have gone by, fact is, you have to be able to reach people and get them to answer questions honestly and have it be a representative sample of the population in order for your polling results to be accurate. And the fact is, in recent elections, in spite of all of our scientific advances in polling technology and the science of polling, pollsters have been fantastically wrong about the outcome of a few of the presidential elections. And so the theory is that the best way to know what the people actually want is what people actually vote for. That elections yield really valuable information about the policy preferences of the citizenry, more reliable than we can get through surveys and polling. There's one more thing to keep in mind about this idea of how many people should get to vote. And this is the idea of that dilution of votes can actually be healthy in a society in bringing stability. And the idea is that the larger the voting electorate, the bigger the pool of people that you have voting, the more difficult it is to form special interest coalitions for redistributive ends. So if you combine, for example, in the early days of the United States, a number of colonies or states from different regions, it prevents, let's say, the industrialized northern states from exploiting the southern agricultural states and vice versa. Or it prevents urban areas, lots of voters, from taking advantage or oppressing rural voters and so forth. So the idea is the bigger the country or the bigger the voting pool, the more people in a state vote, the harder it is for one special interest group or maybe a group of political fanatics to somehow hijack the political process and impose their policy preference, kind of specialized policy preferences tyrannically on everyone else or to get their way about everything. Now, the Federalist Papers expressed concern that large electorates are actually vulnerable to factions. In the Federalist Papers, they said that the inherent weakness of democracies is because they're so big and because people's votes are so diluted, no one person's vote is going to throw an election, right? So if you don't vote in the next election, it's probably not going to change the outcome. But the problem the founders saw is a lot of people are going to think it like that. And most people are going to be politically disengaged a lot of the time and focused on just their work and their families and the things that they enjoy doing. And this allows a special interest group or a small cabal of billionaires or a group of political fanatics to hijack the process because most people aren't really paying attention and a lot of people aren't going to vote at all on election day. So there was a concern that voter dilution could actually create vulnerability to the a democracy being hijacked by a small group of people who are not going to treat the majority very well once they're in power. But I've just set up an argument that goes both ways, and I want my students to really think about this. The idea that if we combine, for example, all of the countries in Western Europe or all of the countries in the Middle East into one country, that it would be hard for one country to impose its will on everyone else. The founders of our country were concerned that the opposite could also happen. And that concludes my little lecture about voting rights and the law and economics of how democracies work with expanding or restricting the vote. Thanks for watching.